and the Philippine intellectual landscape. I am MJ Nuki, a first-year philosophy graduate student, and together with me is Mr. Negi Samri Koresma, also a first-year philosophy graduate student, and we will be your moderators for this evening. Before we proceed with the conference proper, let us start with a short prayer. We now put ourselves in the holy presence of God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Help us, O Lord, to learn the truths thy word imparts, to study that thy laws may be inscribed upon our hearts. Help us, O Lord, to live the faith which we proclaim, that all our thoughts and words and deeds may glorify your name. Help us, O Lord, to teach the beauty of your ways, that yearning souls may find the Christ and sing aloud his praise. Saint Thomas Aquinas, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, MJ. Once again, good evening, everyone. Welcome for this conference. Today is our second day, and I hope you were able to attend the first one yesterday. So before we start with our first speaker, here are some reminders. No, I'll just read through it. This graduate conference is free and open to the public. We do not require any registration prior to attending. Please make sure to keep your microphones muted to avoid any unnecessary distractions. We would discourage you from keeping your videos on so as not to consume too much bandwidth allocation. Each day has designated moderators who will monitor the time allotted for each speaker and to sort out the questions and comments during the discussion portion. For keynote lectures, we have a maximum of 1 hour, 40 to 45 minutes for the presentation, with the remaining 15 to 20 minutes for discussions. For graduate paper presentations, maximum of 30 minutes is allotted, 10 to 15 minutes for the presentation, while the remaining 15 to 20 minutes for discussion. Questions and comments will be entertained via the chat box. The moderator will be the one who will assist the speakers by reading the questions and comments. Please note that not all will be entertained due to time constraints. Should there be more focused queries for presenters, the Book of Abstracts contains the email addresses of the speakers and the organizing committee members. You may contact them directly. Please be reminded that the entire conference is recorded. We expect that you observe utmost respect and professionalism in treating the speakers, moderators, and all participants. Please refrain from flooding the chat box with unnecessary and offensive remarks. We will give certificates after the entire conference. Towards the end of each day, we will make available the evaluation form for that particular session. You must attend at least 3 sessions or days to receive a certificate. Please be reminded to use the same email address in answering the evaluation form, to use the same name which you wish to appear on the certificate. Lastly, please like our Facebook pages to get updated and with the conference and the future events. So please like Lectio, a graduate journal of philosophy, and Society of Tomasian Graduate Students of Philosophy. All of these reminders are posted in the chat box. So thank you very much. And now we welcome our first presenter. Our first speaker is Ms. Jenina Redrino. She is an assistant professor in De La Salle College of St. Benilde and a PhD graduate student in De La Salle University, Manila. She will be presenting her paper entitled A Feminist Reading of the 1924 to 1930 UNITAS articles on the role and status of the Filipina woman. Please welcome Ms. Jenina Redrino.
Hi po. Good evening. May I present my slides now? And there you go. Can you guys see my presentation?
Yes, Miss Jenina.
Yes, please.
Okay, so I'll start. Good evening to all of you, my fellow refugees of wisdom. I am Jenina Redrino, and I am honored to present to you my paper entitled A Feminist Reading of the 1924 to 1930 UNITAS Articles on the Role and Status of the Filipino Woman. This exploratory study attempted to trace a genealogy of indigenous women's thought exhausted from the 1924 and 1927 articles in the earliest scientific research journal of the University of Santo Tomas, UNITAS. These corpus are again compiled in the recently published Doing Philosophy in the Philippines, the Tomasian Collection, Volume 1. Employing a feminist textual and historical reading, the proponent examined Cedal M. and Edelwina Hess's articles to draw the generation's portrayal of the Filipino woman's role and status. The proponent sought to capture her character, treasured social values, and gender norms from the conservative halls of the time. That is, against the backdrop of the transition from the 3 centuries long Spanish sovereignty to the new masters of the Philippine Islands, the Americans. With this, my project has two agenda in mind. First, it navigated the earliest scholarly attempts to discourse intellectually, or to borrow the words of Dr. Alfredo Poe, the logos spermaticus of an indigenous intellectual landscape, spoken by feminine voices. Second, and in turn, to point out a genealogy of feminist pre-philosophical agenda, or emerging streams of shapes of Filipino consciousness, as Scott describes in the earliest known Filipino scholarly engagements. I argue that, albeit the influence of religion in molding the feminine consciousness and womanhood gracefully achieved through education, matrimony, and motherhood, a woman's dignity is threatened whenever she attempts to transcend these grounds. Despite the limitation of avenues, especially for women, and the novelty of publication at the time, it is praiseworthy to note the invaluable role of UNITAS to witness and record the first steps towards the search for meaning and place of the woman in the colonial Philippines. The articles illumined hope and a quest for acknowledgement of a woman's significant contribution within and outside the bounds of family life. Such is her constant existential battle cry, her dignity unrecognized if not smeared. Immersing into the literature, the two-page article of the author that goes with the pen name or initials of Cedal M commences with the woman's acknowledgement of her indebtedness to her conversion to Christianity and emancipation from her native identity. Cedal M. and Edelwina Hesse, the second author for that matter, painted the picture of a socially transformed and elevated woman thanks to her Redeemer Christianity. However, despite her grasp in Christian catechism and etiquette, her upbringing lacked formal education, which was only granted to men. Underscoring her unquestionable role as the mother and first teacher, Cedal M. strongly asserts had Spain and established academic institutions of the time had given women formal educational training, not only an individual is transformed, but the nation as a whole. Then came 1989. Encouraged by the changes brought by American liberalism and democracy, Cedal M. sees remarkable progress and foresees promising improvements in the life of the Filipino woman. Adding to her Christian moral refinement was granted privilege to higher education and to be of service to her fellow men. What could be the service the author pertains to? Is it activism in national building, in nation building, and more social visibility? Ironically, the article prematurely concludes in a negation, if not an abandonment of her battle cry, her fervent demand for nationalism inspired by our heroes and hopeful activism has yet to ripen. Cedal M. writes, and I quote, "The sensible Filipino woman does not crave for suffrage, for she is content in her peaceful home where she is resolved to keep her reign supreme. A sensible woman who initially hoped for equality and be in the forefront, humbly and nobly returns in the background. Such is the prophetic resume of a woman that the author depicts. Her service entails the preparation of our men to be of service to the country." Let it be her contribution and her sacrifice. The two-part article published in 1927, entitled A Study on the Social Status of Woman as Influenced by Religion, was authored by Sister Edelwina Hesse. She was the first directress of the Holy Ghost College, now College of the Holy Spirit, between 1920 and 1947. An educator and administrator of unequaled ability, her educational philosophy was the soul of education is the education of the soul. She envisioned a new breed of educated women. It was during Edelwina's incumbency that the school expanded and opened the high school and the collegiate courses for girls. And true enough, her mission actualized, especially at the time when education for young women was not a social priority. The German nuns inadvertently contributed much to women's liberation by helping them find a sense of worth through quality education. The Christian theological and educational stand of Hesse was clearly evoked in the corpus of her work. It exhaustively surveyed the scriptural as well as the cultural and historical narratives, aimed to shed light on the various phases in the social position of a woman. In her discussion, Hesse argues that a woman's social status is contingent to the inviolable sanctity of marriage or corrupted notion of a family, and that a woman's standing is inherently affected by the very presence and absence of clear religious convictions. Lacking much context, Hesse's quest begins with the issue of divorce. Straightforwardly, her work drops the stand of the church and maintains that divorce not only disposes of a Christian heritage, but most of all, this is the sanctity of the holy matrimony. Hesse criticizes how divorce smears the dignity of a woman. She writes, and I quote, "Let mankind see what precious heritage it casts away by lax attitude. And to make a woman realize her dignity rises and falls with that of the family. And that it is through the family, the germ cell of society, that her renewal is possible." Going back to the question that arises as to how and why the issue of divorce came to light, interestingly, the timing of the article's publication aligns with the arrival of what Deogracias T. Reyes describes as the first threat to the Filipino home. That is absolute divorce. In his 1953 article, Reyes narrates, "The moment the Americans set foot in the Philippine Islands, they brought with them the notion of absolute divorce. Although relative divorce in the form of legal separation of marriage was permitted by the Spanish government's Las Siete Partidas, Act number 2710, or the law of absolute divorce, was granted subsequently by the new American government on March 1917, after the provision of religious freedom and separation of the church and state. Years later, the policies on easy divorce laws were lobbied. For 26 years, the divorce law remained in force until it was repealed during the Japanese occupation in 1943. Resisting the widespread secularization of the country, has exhaustively surveyed the leading early civilizations' historical, religious, and cultural practices vis-a-vis the dominance of Christian doctrine in championing the dignity of a woman. The Christian defense of human dignity of Hesse naturally begins with the Genesis story, recalling Eve's status as the co-operator of Adam and the co-creator of God. She emphasized the dignity and purity of the first parents before the fall. More so, Hesse forwards and adheres to the Hebrew etymology of woman as wife-man, indicating her status as one with man in nature and differed only in sex, contrary to the Greco-Roman femina, or childbearer, referring to sex only. The Hebrew signification acknowledges a woman's worth equivalent to that of a man. Although their sex and spheres of activity differ, still one must adopt to each function. After the fall, God demarcated their roles. Women shall suffer the pangs of birth under the dominion of the husband, while the man shall toil and labor for his family all the days of his life. The succeeding parts of the essay was a detailed recap of the biblical events after the fall, underscoring the perversion of human dignity and violation of marriage in the Old Testament. From scriptural, Hesse moved to a historico-cultural survey of the contemporary civilization's pagan culture's treatment of women. This led Hesse to conclude and claim, and I quote, everywhere the natural position of woman is recognized to be one of subordination to man. Notwithstanding the diversity in culture and religious background, Hesse describes the non-practicing Christian women, although having a sacred role to play in marriage, but outside she was nothing. Hesse claims that marriage was out of religious duty and not mutual affection, while chastity or voluntary single life is unknown, if not punished or deemed as the basest appetite. In the second part, Hesse forwards the argument of Christ's renewal of the world, equates to the renewal of women's position in society. The realization of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, through God's incarnate, the woman and the family's dignity was rehabilitated. The birth of Christ renewed and reinstituted the dignity of marriage in paradise. Through Mary, the new Eve, and her humble word, behold the handmaid of the Lord, saved the human race from the fall, as Hesse writes, through her virginal motherhood, Mary established for all future generations the absolute rank and place of a woman, who therefore to the end of time shall call her blessed. The sanctity of the virginal life, mirrored by the Holy Family, Mary's voluntary virginity and birth, renewed the woman's independent human dignity, her personal value before God. These doctrines uplifted the chaste life and motherhood in the person of Mary. Her fulfillment alone was strong enough to restore women and marriage to their pristine nobility, for God chose a mortal woman as instrumental in the coming of the Messiah. Rehabilitation of marriage to its original dignity. The very thesis of the work, that is, on the rehabilitation of marriage to its original dignity, was realized through the person of Christ and his love towards his church. The first miracle, the wedding at Cana, and Christ's explicit response, preaching the indissoluble union of man and wife to the Pharisees, provoking question and divorce, renewed and defended its sanctity. Enriching the renewed dignity of the couple, the union edified the role and worth of rearing children of God and for God, a duty attributed most specially to a woman. The nurturing and protection of the Christian family, as stated in the main premise, supernaturally elevated the role of and status of a woman. The woman, a person of equal dignity to man, a nurturer, a wife, and the mother, is the church personified, and in turn justifies the institution's inexorable guardianship to the sacrament of marriage. Synthesis and conclusion. Pregnant with the promising feminist thoughts, the tension and contrast between the article surfaces when placed vis-a-vis the backdrop of the cultural and political landscape of the time. Caught in between, in a period of transition, both works speaks of attempts to defend and resist the deep-seated Christian tradition in the advent of the American regime. One, written by Cedal M., favors the changes brought by her new masters. On the contrary, the articles written by Edelwina Hesse denounce liberalism and religious agnosticism, influenced by the United States. Indeed, the 300-year influence of colonial Spain and the Roman Catholic Church could not be easily undone. At the heart of these two articles is a transition from an unknown pre-colonial identity to the colonial woman's search for meaning and worth. Having little knowledge of her roots, perhaps caused by the inherent regionalism in the pre-colonial Philippine Islands, or due to it having prematurely nipped in the bud, the Filipino woman learns her value from what she was taught and expected to be by her colonizers. Earned from the Spanish regime's mission of evangelization through education, she was molded into a woman of faith, a woman converted from her native otherness and elevated to a person of equal dignity as his male counterpart after receiving faith. Including the ideas of divorce and higher learning in the equation, its tolerance and advocacy ushers to the depreciation and abandonment of her refined Christian values. This comes in full circle with the two articles' premise that the dignity of women rises and falls in the married and family life. In conclusion, The analysis of these two early academic texts, although limited, painted a picture of Filipino woman's identity initially secured through and within her faith. Also, albeit her wishing to be of service, the desire to transcend the family life is a threat, smearing if not diminishing her identity. For Hesse, the primacy of the glory of the woman's dignity lies in her faith, the renewed church, celibacy, and matrimony. While for Cedal M, her status can be seen through her participation in society and having equal privileges, most notably in the aspect of education. With this, the proponent puts forward how these canons revealed to us a stream of our indigenous feminine consciousness, that is, a quest for equal inherent and civic worth, one indebted to the coming of Christianity in the Philippine soil. It elevated her dignity as equal to man in the eyes of God and the Church. The other one, influenced by the arrival of liberal America, the enrichment of her academic and social footing as having equal privilege to man. That ends my presentation. Thank you for your attention and time.
Thank you, Ms. Jenina, for your presentation. The virtual floor is now open for the audience questions, comments, or insights. So maybe the audience are still typing their comments, questions, or insights from your presentation. Well, sir, since there's no one has asked a question yet, maybe I can start one, Miss Janina. Sige. Um, you mentioned in your abstract, no, and it's not something that I saw in your presentation. Uh, what do you mean by finding social activism? It's in the abstract, no? I'm just reading it now. What do you mean by finding social activism and renewal of society's conception of womanhood? From these articles, no, to establish the role and status of Filipina woman. What do you mean by social activism? Is it something that in your something that's in your paper? Yeah. Sige.
Thank you, Mr. Correa, for the question. Uh, Actually, while I was initially when I wrote the abstract, that was the impression, especially in the first article, the 1923, although it's just two-page article written by Cedal M. At first, without in the surface level, it appears that the author was promoting some form of nationalism, some kind of a search for activism. But then again, when I sit down and really immerse myself into the text and consider the what I tried to do is let the text speak for itself. Somehow it's as if these two articles are conversing with each other. And then I was, as I mentioned in the discussion of Cedal M's paper, it's a bit of I'm a bit disappointed. I don't want to include my value judgment into the paper because syempre mag-iba na yung essence ng paper, but that's the impression. Initially, I'm seeing traces of parang search for nationalism, patriotism to emancipate from the colonizers, but then uh, the latter part of the paper, as I've cited earlier, uh, and the quote was, the Filipino woman doesn't need suffrage, or she doesn't seek for suffrage. So yeah, it was for me it's a failed attempt to fully um, emancipate or establish the woman's role from at that stage, just by immersing myself into the text. The intention of perhaps realizing her independence. So yeah, that's my answer to the question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you also. I'm glad that it's something that's clear on your part, as you go through your research and your paper.
Yes.
So, yes, si ano po, Christopher, Sir Christopher Ryan Maboloc, you want to say something?
Yes, I'd like to ask a question to
Yes.
Jenina. Good
Sige po.
evening, Jenina. How would you define being independent as a woman? Don't you think historical context and culture also inform the kind of attitude of people? And how does the environment contribute to it, given the differences nowadays compared to the past in terms of the role of women? Do you think if a woman is, say, a housewife, does it diminish her dignity as a person? So, in that respect, she should be somebody who must pursue a career instead of, say, conserving her energies to make her husband and family happy. And thus, what do you think is being independent in this respect? Thank you, Janine.
Thank you, Sir Mabolok. Again, the context plays a significant role in um, fully understanding the perhaps or listening to the voices of these three articles. And again, the concept of independence of a woman, considering that point in our history, it's fully understandable how and why these texts um, really adheres and promotes the concept of matrimony and the family life. Okay, again, and that it's just that again, as I've mentioned earlier, there was this. I was hoping, perhaps, as someone again, that's a value judgment that I do not want to impose on the paper, but I was hopeful when Sidel M mentioned about uh, her or women having access to higher education at the time. Thank you to the United States, the liberal ideas of the United States, to higher education for giving women access to formal education. So, uh, kaya that's my answer as to why I was
Um,
hoping there's a possibility that she'll go beyond the family life or the home. But there's no judgment to that. No, this even at this contemporary time, there's
Okay.
nothing wrong with women being a career woman or a mother or a housewife. There's no discrimination as to that to those
Yeah.
labels or status.
Yeah, I understand. Maybe we look into something that is fundamental. Do you think it's something that is rooted in the autonomy of the person, or is it something that is informed by culture or tradition as regard to how we define ourselves as human beings, whether you're a woman or somebody who
Mm.
belongs to the LGBT? Of course, as you mentioned, the Americans, the Thomasites, were helpful in terms of empowering women, but don't you think there's that conflict, a conflict that stays even nowadays as regard to the meaning of autonomy, which is primarily uh, rooted in the Enlightenment tradition, and the context of culture, which is something that is informed by history and many other factors in this respect. So, thank you, Janina.
Yes, thank you, Sir Mabolok. And I also concur with what you just mentioned. It's really difficult to single out, perhaps, or identify the essence or the nature of a human person, considering the complexity of our backgrounds, our upbringing, the culture where we um, our culture, our religion. So yeah, even at the context of what I'm presenting. Uh, Again, I'm through these limited references. I tried to immerse and listen to these voices without much um, background, shall I say, or context because of the limitation of the initial um, technicalities of writing. Unlike today, now we have to include the biases, the cultural references to our writings, our scholarly work. If you observe these references as well, um, you really have to look at it as part of a big ecosystem of a part of a social and historical landscape. So there you go po. That's my comment.
Thank you, Jenina. The paper is very good. Okay.
Thank you po.
Thank you, Sir Mabolo, for your question. So, any more questions? Well, since there's no more questions, thank you, Miss Jenina, for your presentation. So, we will now proceed with our next speaker.
Thank you, Sir Levi. Our second speaker is a PhD candidate at the UST Graduate School. He is writing a dissertation on critical pedagogy based on Axel Honneth's recognition theory. His research interests include philosophy of education, indigenous studies, and critical theory. He is also one of the recipients of the 2020 Don Isabelo de los Reyes Prize in Research in Filipino Philosophy given by the Philosophical Association of the Philippines. And he is currently an assistant professor at the Ateneo de Naga University. He will be presenting his paper entitled Translating the Religio-Cultural Significance of Santigwar into a Philosophical Language of Critique. Let us all welcome Mr. Victor John Loquias.
Thank you, Sir MJ. Can you hear me well? Am I okay?
Yes, sir.
Audible now? Okay, thank you. Wait lang, sir. All right. Good evening, everyone. I will present my research, and this is still a work in progress paper. Um, I don't know if in the book of abstracts, sometimes it appears reconfiguring, but here in my presentation, I chose the word translating the religio-cultural significance of Santigwar into a philosophical language of critique. For those who do not know this, of course, because this is coming from Bicol experience, Santigwar is a folk healing practice in the Bicol region that incorporates and blends elements from Christian belief with local and folk ways of healing. While contested nowadays as a medically effective way of healing, it is nonetheless a cultural artifact, an amalgamation of the local culture and Christian belief system. In 2006, Christian Cordero published his poetry book. It's a collection of poems, Santigwar. A semantic bridge has been inaugurated, transporting its religio-therapeutic significance to the philosophical terrain of social critique. My paper fundamentally argues that Santigwar could be employed as a normative resource for developing a local concept of critique mediated through Cordero's poetic reconfiguration of its practice. This idea is developed gradually in the paper. The first part presents Pagsantigwar not only Pagsantigwar here as the practice, okay? Not only as a local and folk practice of healing, but as a cultural artifact of conversion and resistance based on ethnographical, anthropological, and historiographical accounts. This establishes the normativity of Santigwar within the religious, cultural, and social milieu among the people. Second part, the second part explains that Cordero's poetics capitalizes on the twofold elements of diagnosis and prognosis in the Pagsantiguar applied to social reality. So in this way, Cordero has translated the original practice of identifying causes of corporal maladies and giving therapeutic prescription performed by the Parasantiguar into a task of the writer in general towards his ailing society. The religio-cultural value of Santigwar assumes thus a new intellectual significance realigned towards a project of social emancipation. The remainder of the paper traces some intersecting lines between the critical elements enunciated in Cordero's poetics with a specific brand of doing social criticism called immanent critique, which I gleaned from Axel Honneth's critical theory. The hospitality of a recognitive framework in the analysis of culturally indigenous practices initially renders the legitimacy of the theory's appropriation in this paper. The notions of normativity, recognition, and emancipation serve as my conceptual anchors in the translation of the indigenous practice of Santigua into the philosophical language of Greek. On the other hand, this articulation hopefully opens the local experience to further discursive avenues which Cordero's poetry has just mediated. Okay. So I go now to Santigua as a cultural artifact of conversion and resistance. Now, Cordero's observation of the behavior among Bicolanos, particularly in the rural areas, when having a physical malady is popular knowledge. The immediate recourse is to approach a Parasantiguar because it is cheaper. But there are others whose tendency is the reverse, which could pretty much describe those in the urban areas, like the affluent, who would go to the doctor first, but when medically scientific prognosis shows no possibility, would eventually turn to the Parasantiguar with that irrational leap of faith as last recourse. This standard practice reveals, in fact, the multifaceted feature surrounding Santiguar among Bicolanos. The available studies in this practice and cognate themes show a coalescence of economic, sociocultural, historical, and religious dimensions that establish Santiguar's normativity in the people's experience. Current empirical studies on Santiguar among locals in different parts of the region generally associates it with folk healing. But not all folk healing can be identified with the need for Santiguar. It is a specific procedure that a healer or parabulong, from a more famous term would be albularyo, who becomes a parasantiguar in its performance, does in cases when it is needed. In candid serious table of the different causes, particular ailments treated by folk healer, and therapeutic measures for each, Santiguar consistently functions as a diagnostic procedure for peculiar maladies. These are the illnesses which are suspected and believed to be supernaturally caused. There appears to be a variety of supernatural entities behind illnesses. One common cause identified also in Ariola, Loza, and other studies is the tawong lipod, literally unseen or aggrieved persons in Ariola's term, which the sick person is deemed to have had a disruptive contact with. So Zerina Labayo traces the term from the Latin sanctificare, uh, and the practice in old times, commonly known in Spanish as making the sign of the cross while uttering words of prayer, especially when one needs to be protected from evil. while Cordero identifies the term as a juxtaposition of the two Spanish terms, santo and agua, or holy water, and the practice as signifying the giving of blessing and healing. The etymology and initial images conjured by or involved in the practice already enunciate the religious, specifically Christian elements that imply the colonial history of the region. The preparation and procedure elicit the image of exorcism, but it should not be mistaken as such. The supernatural causes of the malady are neither devils nor treated as devils by both the healer and the sick, but recognized instead as coexisting in the world. Their locus or space is believed to have been disrupted, the signs of which manifests corporeally in the person's illness. Rodney Henry's description of the Filipino animistic worldview would be helpful here in putting in place the cosmological system implied in the belief. The supernatural world consists of an otherworldly and this worldly dimension. Okay, wait. Yeah, let me see first. I'm sorry, I'm not aware of it. Let me fix this first. Oh, yeah. Oh, can I just put it that way na lang?
Yes, yes, much better.
Okay, I'll just put it that way. So I'm on that part already. Thanks for getting my attention. Yes, so I'm on Rodney Henry's description of the Filipino animistic worldview. The supernatural world consists of an otherworldly and this worldly dimension. This natural world, in turn, is the world governed by science. But both the supernatural, this worldly dimension, and natural world continue to influence everyday human experience. And the Santigwar navigates both worlds. The Christian elements mirrored in Santigwar confirm foremost the presence or embeddedness of Christianity in the region. The belief in this practice manifests a shared cultural worldview found in both rural and urban Catholicism, to borrow F. Landahucano's division. Like what he writes, the touch of magic, which is the recurrent theme of provincial rites, has not been replaced in the urban area. Santigwar could be identified, therefore, as a cultural artifact of conversion in the sense of the Christianity's presence through time in the region. This is already manifest in the etymology, the elements of the ritual, like the sign of the cross, to commence the exorcism-like procedure, in the Catholic tradition, of course. The oration, with combinations of Latin, Spanish, and native terms. Danilo Hirona provides a historiographical account for the appropriation of these foreign terms. The technique of conversion employed in the early colonial period is the translation and teaching of the gospel in the native tongue. However, I quote him here verbatim, its limited vocabulary did not include the words needed for an adequate teaching of the principles of faith. Such concepts and corresponding words for Dios, Gracia, Salvacion, Espiritu Santo, Cruz, Santos, and others were foreign to the natives and consequently not found in their language. The untranslatability of these concepts into native terms gave the natives an impression of the intrinsic superiority of the Latin Castilian languages over the local ones. The use of Latin as a standard ritual language of the Catholic Church endowed this language with almost magical and supernatural characteristics. This explains why native healers appropriated this language into their pagan rituals in the form of mutilated Latin incantations. We are reminded here of Vicente Rafael's perspective of fishing, where he problematized the technique of translation in the process of conversion. Confronted with the almost incomprehensible language of the foreign, the natives hook out onto the words of the friars and reconfigures it in his own terms. As Rafael writes, the idiom of religious conversion was crucial in that it shaped the terms of native surrender just as it lent to the articulation of popular resistance to a colonizing power. Conceived dialectically, conversion requires one's submission to and incorporation of the language and logic of Christianity as the condition of possibility for defining and subsequently overcoming one's prior state of subordination, whether to a pagan past, a colonial overlord, or the local elite. The Christian elements in Santigwar could be viewed similarly as a localization of the foreign, which grants it at the same time the language of resistance in its agentive reconfiguration by the natives. Thus, while Santigwar may serve as a cultural artifact of conversion during the early days of colonization, it is at the same time an artifact of the particular kind of resistance exhibited by the natives in the region that could be traced in relation to and compared with other modes of resistance in the wider history of the nation. Hirona speaks of an resistance of the natives in resistance of indigenous practices such as ritual drinking and ritual crying or pag-arang that forged solidarity among the natives behind the backs of the friars. They were forms of silent resistance in its embeddedness in the culture. Santigwar is another form of silent resistance in its continuing presence in the people's worldview, even up to this time, where the animistic cosmology manifests to merge, if not problematize, Christianity and modern conceptions of reality. Animism, which Henry states, is based on a central belief in spirits whose power can be manipulated through formulas, rituals, or words, has its strength on the everyday concerns of the people. Santigwar showcases the fact that there was no problem in merging the local and the foreign belief systems. Folk Catholicism, or more generally folk Christianity, is the coexistence of two religions in the same person without inconsistencies. Yeah, I'm gonna skip this long. There's another scholar who did an extensive study on this practice, and yeah, her name is Fenelia Canel. Her ethnographic study in the Bicol reinforces this normativity in the Bicolano experience, and the negotiation of the ultimate and animistic concerns spoken of by Henry is obviously performed by the healer. Like Reynaldo Ileto's description of the investments of power in the anting-anting through the Passion, Canel describes similarly that a healer's replication of Christ's death and resurrection endows her with power in relation to the Tao, or the agreed Tao, the unseen Tao. But it's also a shamanic journey undertaken in the company of her two of Sarok, or spirit companion. Now, there, I will not explain anymore. Hybrid Christianity was another one of my sources. Another of my sources is also in Ateneo, who did an ethnographic study. But he also mentions that a hybrid Christianity. Now let me turn to Cordero's Poetics of Social Diagnosis. Now I'm limited time. So Cordero's work is a poetics of the diagnostic therapeutic elements of the practice of Santigwar applied to social reality. It is embedded in the normative experience of the region, wherein Santigwar plays the ambivalent places of cosmology and mythology, Christianity in its anomaly. But what he performs further in his poetry is a reconfiguration of Santigwar into an aesthetic piece that creates and infuses in it new life and significance. Cordero reproduces the original use value of Santigwar into a work of art. As Walter Benjamin writes, the uniqueness of a work of art is inseparable from its being embedded in the fabric of tradition. This tradition itself is thoroughly alive and extremely changeable. Cordero maintains the ritual character of Santigwar and landscapes further avenues of significations in its metaphorical configuration. As Benjamin further insists, it is significant that the existence of the work of art with reference to its aura is never entirely separated from its ritual function. In other words, the unique value of the authentic work of art has its basis in ritual, the location of its original use value. But Cordero's reconfiguration of it into a metaphor can also be perceived already as a distortion of the truth which has previously defined Santigwar, including the various contestations to that truth. Drawing inspiration from the early Frankfurt School's perspective of literature, Virgilio Almario explains that every metaphor or figurative in literature is a mechanism for distorting the truth. Every metaphor in literature product of the intense and acute experiencing of the reality of the world, so that it comes to us in the reading as not ordinary, puzzling, and often unbelievable. Of course, this distortion in literature happens in the language, no? In the way the poet or the writer reconfigures the language. Halia. Um, Halia is one of the poems in the collection that showcases both its embeddedness and distortion of tradition and truth. The poem Halia rehearses the pre-colonial ritual called Halia, which Malcolm Mintz defines as a ritual offered to the Gugurang, or the god of goodness. The ritual is held on the nights of the full moon to frighten off the Bakunawa, who would swallow the moon if not scared away. Cordero reconfigures, however, the image of this ritual and conjures the itom na babae, referring to the Virgin of Peñafrancia, instead of the mythological Gugurang. Like the old Santigwar, Cordero in his new mode of Pagsantiguar liberally brews elements into his poetry that come from the people's experiences as the devotion to the Virgin, which seems to enunciate the unproblematic merging of the Christian faith in the old animistic worldview. Yet, the diagnostic function of the Pagsantiguar is maintained by Cordero. Only this time it becomes a diagnosis of a society seemingly unaware of its maladies in the present. So, let me focus. Am I still online?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so let me focus on these three metaphors in the collection that showcase Cordero's reconfiguration of Santigwar. Pulang signos, or red signs, translates the original bodily symptoms of a sick person into signs or symptoms of social maladies like poverty, political dynasty, environmental degradation, etc. These are caused by demons or yawa. And the main cause, the Bakunawa, this one, the Bakunawa. Originally a red serpent that swallows the moon, popular in Bicolan and Filipino mythology, has now taken in a new form. These are modernization, industrialization, and challenge political culture. And what is the measure? Pagsantigwar, of course. Pagsantigwar sa Banwaan is the diagnostic procedure which now falls in the hands of the poet and the writers. I gave here a part of that poem. This is my translation, of course. Let us diagnose our land, get a big torch that eternally burns, use the volcano's fire that strengthens our souls. And once we have recognized and named these demons like the typhoons and other misfortunes, only then shall our land be healed from its maladies. Okay, I will move on to the last part. So Santigwar is an immanent critique from metaphor to philosophical analysis. Axel Honneth found in Ralph Ellison's novel, The Invisible Man, the literary piece to present his discursive elaboration of the epistemology of recognition and the absence thereof in the literary concept of invisibility. I find Christian Cordero's Santigwar an indigenous literary piece that captures what is called immanent critique, of course, in Honneth's critical theory. This mode of critique begins from the fundamental principle of from the fundamental principle of the normative recognition, which serves as the social ontological foundation for the connectivity of persons and his society. Social critique in this context should always be grounded on the moral claims of persons, which inform their normative orientations as singular individual persons and members of distinct cultural groups. However, Honneth have earlier identified disrespect as the normative foundation for critique. Disrespect, of course, has a wider coverage for Honneth because it includes various forms of misrecognition that metastasize over time into social pathologies. The use of the clinical term pathology that originally refers to illness metaphorically signified the misdevelopments or social aberrations that philosophy, as social critique, aims to disclose. This elucidates the specific work that social critique does. This could also be described by the medical term diagnosis or the precise detection and definition of an illness afflicting the human organism in order to apply measures for regaining health. Hence, the articulation of various forms of disrespect becomes the fundamental task of social critique within specific social contexts in order to determine where social therapeutic measures are needed. Paulo Bolaños have already emphasized the need for a more materialist anthropological standpoint in doing philosophy in the Philippines, which an appropriation of critical philosophy could supply. He says that philosophical enterprise here in the Philippines, as we know it, suffers from a failure to reflect on factual realities that materially shape our psycho-socio-political behavior and ensuing pathological consequences therein. I take this to mean, however, as a deficit of the practitioners of philosophy in the different regions where intellectual enterprise has been particularly wanting for social engagement with issues within their locality. Last points. The articulation of indigenous values, okay, is tantamount to an articulation of social normality, which consists in culturally independent conditions that allow a society's members to experience undistorted self-realization. The imperative of identifying the existing normative structures that inform and reproduce societal forms of interaction before critique, as Artipada rightly perceives, is important in avoiding free-floating interpretations of normative values. So the social criticism of the indigenous forms of misrecognition would then be based on the empirical description of what a given culture regards as a disorder. And this is what is meant by immanent critique, which is right there in the screen. And this is no less than also the kind of social critique that Cordero has mediated through his Poetics of Santigwar. And from there, from what Cordero started, from his reconfiguration, from metaphor, philosophical praxis could then follow. I hope you would. Yeah, I'll end there. No, this is the paper. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Victor Ron Loquias, for your presentation.
Thank you, sir.
The virtual floor is now open for questions, comments, and insights.
Can I answer Doc
Yes.
Michael Fernandez?
So, Mr. Loquias, here's a question from Michael Roland Hernandez. I'll be reading it first, sir. Since the practice of Santigwar is a form of resistance, with possible emancipatory effects in spite of its being shaped by the Catholic religious experience, are you implying that the violence of colonization can be justified by the recourse to religion or simply to the gift of faith?
No, sir. I am not. No. I am actually implying here that the practice itself, Pagsantiguar, is already a way of confronting colonization. They did not see it problematic. Well, of course, I am basing my claims on records. No, they did not see it problematic at all. No, to reconfigure their practice, like for example, to adopt to adopt elements from the Christian religion. No? And that is why the Christian religion that is preponderant in the region cannot, in fact, be probably reduced only to, probably to the original Christianity, because the practices manifest, that sabi ni Dr. Conde, it seems that there are people here who would manifest a hybrid kind of Christianity. Unfortunately, I did not have the time to discuss that. So no, it's not even a gift of faith, because they were also using faith, to make sense, in their everyday resistance. Yeah, the translation of the things which are there already, okay, in making sense of their own everyday lives.
Thank you, Mr. Loquias, and thank you, Mr. Hernandez, for your question.
Thank you, Sir Fernandez.
Pwede mag-follow up?
Sure po.
Pwede mag-follow up, Mr. MC?
You may, Sir Hernandez.
Pwede mag-follow up?
Yes, sir.
Basically, just to drive home the point more uh, kasi yung problem ko is if you're using Santigwar, which you have basically traced to a transformation or translation of a certain colonial element, no? For example, you mentioned about yung combination ng word na yung sa santo plus agua, etc. So in other words, you basically translated or transformed the elements of elements coming from the colonial masters, no? And you, as you have said, you have used it to basically uh, produce a form of resistance, no? So ang ano ko doon is those resources were actually coming from the masters themselves, no? So, and if it's something that you use to basically inform practices, behavior, culture, etc., then you could say that, you know that's quote unquote a good gift that's coming from the foreign other, so in that sense you could say that colonization has actually done something good for you, don't you think? Thank you.
Okay, sir. Well, my research now leads me to the sources even of the elements of Pagsantiguar, not only within the Christian religion, no? Because the sign of the cross, of course, that manifests the Christian elements, no? But there are other elements in the Pagsantiguar that could be even traced to other influences. Like I've read the works of Juan Francisco, for example, who would trace influences. But if his, of course, if his study or if his studies are accurate, no, that leads that shows that, well, the practice is an amalgamation not only of the Christian elements but of other elements as well, no? From the Indian influences, for example, via Austronesian, culture, because that's something like that. I did not yet include those things in the paper. No, but what I'm trying to say, sir, here is that there's no exclusive valorization of Christianity among the natives here. No? Well, probably what the gap, of course, here is that what is most recent would be the coming of the Christianity, coming of Christianity, but probably further historiographical or archaeological research would show now that there are actually other influences now, aside from those coming from the colonizers. Okay? But is it the persistence of the practice, which is not in conformity, and it has always been condemned by well, according to my sources, they have been condemned. These practices, these animistic practices, have been condemned by the friars, because they see, that the Christian ideological system was not was not totally or fully successfully embedded in the natives, no. And Santigwar could be this artifact, Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Sir Loquias. Are there any more questions from the audience? Since there are no more questions or comments, we can now proceed with the last presenter for this evening's conference. Once again, thank you, Mr. Victor John Loquias.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, UST.
All right. Last but not the least, he is presently studying at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, taking up his Master's of Arts in History. He earned his bachelor's degree in the same discipline at the University of Santo Tomas, Manila in 2018. His research interests cover political and constitutional history, the local history of Caloocan, and special interest in Salvador Araneta. He is affiliated with the Bayanikasan Research Foundation as its researcher and secretary of the Caloocan Historica and Cultural Studies Association. A former teacher, he is now a corporate employee at a company in Ortigas, Pasig City. He will be presenting his paper entitled Christianity and the Filipino Ideology, the Teachings of the Church as Applied in Salvador Araneta's Bayanikasan. Please welcome Mr. Wogie Pacala.
Can you see my screen na po?
Yes po.
Wait lang po. Nakikita po yung PowerPoint. Sorry.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, good evening. Actually, this idea of Bayanikasan is more on overarching concept. It was an attempt to establish a national identity 50 years ago by the late Salvador Araneta. And actually, we can see Bayanikasan mainly pertaining to the studies of Philippine political science, especially on participatory democracy and Philippine federalism. However, many were not taking note of the other aspects, as Bayanikasan is is tackling three aspects of Philippine society, which is BIP, Philippine values, Philippine institutions, and the Philippine power. So it was an attempt, and as it is reflective in the annals of history during the 1971 Constitutional Convention, the attempt did not prosper as there were many issues that were surrounding it. However, Araneta continued to publish his works on this on Bayanikasan, no, which has produced tons of literatures, and even until his death in 1982, he left so many unfinished manuscripts on this matter. So there were no philosophical reviews and published studies on Bayanikasan because of some scholarly issues, which I will be discussing later. So any outputs, feedbacks, or insights will be greatly appreciated. And this is a working paper as of now. So Bayanikasan is defined as the power of organized togetherness to attain national goals and objectives under the heroic leadership of the people. Some of his proposals, actually, this is the general definition of Bayanikasan as he defined in 1971 in a certain resolution. And it is, for him, Bayanikasan is a complex solution to the problems of the Philippines. So he's not seeing it that there's a some sort of panacea to solve all Philippine problems, but the problems of the Philippine government and society. But there is what he called the triangular dialectics. Okay, so the father and his brainchild. The development of Bayanikasan can be traced during his days as a law student at the University of Santo Tomas, wherein he wrote various articles on commercial law, constitutional law, and many aspects of legal scholarship. And then later on, he studied on Harvard, and then he returned to the Philippines as a lawyer and businessman. And then later on, in 1934 Constitutional Convention, he won in the election for the delegate and represented the 2nd District of Manila. His constitutional ideas and the tripods were developed there, as he submitted several but rejected proposals of the future 1935 Constitution. Again, the tripods of the Bayanikasan, or the dialectics of the triangle, refers to the three democratizations: the democratization of power, democratization of wealth, and democratization of man. So the first tripod is on the democratization of power, wherein he advocated in a resolution during the 1934 Constitutional Convention that the opposition and minority parties should be empowered. I mean, when we say empowered, that majority of the members of a committee on audit and budget must be composed of opposition and minority parties, in which many delegates have disagreed, and this earned him the anger of many delegates, and including the then Senate President Manuel Quezon. On the democratization of man, he is one of the drafters of the Bill of Rights of the 1935 Constitution. On the democratization of wealth, he is a advocate of the national Philippinization, or nationalizing various industries after even beyond independence of the then Commonwealth. So he engaged himself in various civic activities, such as the Nationalist Economic Protectionism Association in 1935 and White Cross Orphanage in 1938. He stopped his law practice, and instead he devoted himself to business education and later on in government service. So it was in the post-war period that he began on further elaborating on the Bayanikasan tripods, his participation in various national issues, such as anti-parity movement in the late 1940s, the Great Economic Policy Debate in 1950s, the call for constitutional change and the Saba issue of 1960, and the 1971 Constitutional Convention became vital in the developing various aspects of the ideology that he imagined, because every time that there was a main issue, he tended to write an article, he would deliver a speech, and the manuscript of those speeches were kept, and then later there were some compilation of his speeches that were published. Okay. So in 1969, he began to write an article of 20 newspaper articles. It is a series discussing what an ideal Filipino constitution should be. So I will be discussing it in the next part. But again, he worked in the 1971 Constitutional Convention as a delegate. He was elected for the second time, but he did not sign the constitution that was prepared because of his accidental exile, wherein he was on a vacation overseas when the martial law was proclaimed. So even though he is abroad, especially in Canada, he wrote the two major canons of Bayanikasan. The first is the Bayanikasan Effective Democracy for All, published in 1976, and the Bayanikasan Constitution that was published a year before his untimely death in 1982. So during the Constitutional Convention, he proposed 70 resolutions and hundreds of amendments, and all of those amendments and resolutions were popped up with various explanatory notes explaining why he had proposed this, what are the conditions, what are the intentions behind those papers. And he also released various speeches and position papers during this time. Okay. So the Filipino ideology, the rationale behind the conceptualization is that Araneta saw the Philippine problems and its solutions in a very complex manner, as I have stated earlier. The proposed alternative or the proposed solution to these Philippine problems is the triangular dialectics. Again, the triangular dialectics is the democratization of a man, democratization of power, and democratization of wealth. He argued that to make benefits of the progress of the physical sciences, there must be a parallel development of social science. The fantastic advance that brought man to the moon must have given also the power to eradicate poverty, which is the main socio-political issue of his time and even up till now, up to now. So Araneta studied the problems of his time and came up with an idea that the Philippine problem, the Philippine issue, is constitutional rather than congenital. He lifted the inspiration rather, from Rizal, quoting the hero. People and government are correlated and complementary. A virtuous government is an anomaly among a righteous people, just as a corrupt people cannot exist under just rules and wise laws. He supplemented that quote by adding that a good constitution that will bring a good government and good economic policies will bring the regeneration and reformation of the people. With both of them, Rizal and Araneta, arriving at the same conclusion that like government, like people. Also, the change is not only institutional but also societal. Borrowing from Mabini's idea, he stated that the radical change should not only be exclusive to the institutions but it must include the behavior and thinking of the people, and there must be an internal and external revolution that must happen according to Mabini. And coming to this conclusion, he stressed the need that the Filipino should take the responsibility of practicing a responsible citizenship in order for these reforms that he espoused to happen. Bayanicracy is a heroic rule under the essence of bayanihan, spirit of the people, influenced by his own synthesis of communist and capitalist views with Christian influence. There were so many reforms as enumerated by Araneta in various writings and documents, but for this presentation, I would like to specify the general principles rather than the detailed ones, as it will take much time. So under the principle of the democratization of wealth, the general idea that he espoused is the sampuhunan or paprocracy, or generally known as popular capitalism, government control in economy, protectionism, and Philippinization of industries. On the democratization of power, the general idea of all these reforms is meritocracy, expansion of checks and balances, and deconcentrating the powers in the government. On the democratization of man, his general principle is based on secular approach in social issues, equality, scientific, nationalist, and Christian-based education, participatory democracy, rethinking the Filipino in its innate consciousness, or basically decolonization and internal cultural revolution inspired by Mabini and Rizal. Many of these reforms can be seen in various published matters, but there are also unpublished ones. So, through a thorough critique and analysis on various specific issues of his time, he was able to formulate Bayanikasan. So now that I have provided a quick and brief overview of Bayanikasan, so I will jump on the Christian influence or Christian sources of the Bayanikasan. So his inspiration is the advice of Pope John Paul XXIII, whose advice is a phenomena must be observed, then studied, so that we could arrive at a correct action. And then the synthesis, antithesis, and synthesis, thesis, and antithesis of Hegel. And then his triangular dialectics, according to him, is patterned after the concept of Holy Trinity. Araneta, just as the church believes agrees with the, upholding man's dignity. As a self-trained economist, he believed that a Christian capitalistic philosophy must be developed, and his inspiration from the Thomistic doctrine on wealth and various papal encyclicals. Various principles that many of these reforms he tend to cite one papal encyclical after another in his explanatory notes in various resolutions during the 1971 convention, and later on formulating various works on the Bayanikasan. So since Araneta is an economist, so I must provide the overview of his Christian economics, or rather Christian capitalistic philosophy, that it is the duty of the rich to help the poor, to own productive property through land reform, profit sharing, and popular capitalism, labor policy to combat unemployment and promote workers' welfare. Its socio-political principles, as inspired by papal teachings, are emphasis on development, order between men, the principle of subsidiarity, and intermediate bodies. His educational policies, which is seen as a tool of Bayanikasan, is focusing more on agricultural and technical research with the purpose to help industrialization efforts of the country. He is believer of the idea that knowledge, like wealth, should be shared to all. Furthermore, scientific education must be also supplied with faith, and education is a tool to provide a materialization of God's will according to him. So this is the Bayanikasan. Sorry. Okay, so now Bayanikasan and Filipino philosophy as a closing part. Just as Claudio stated in his dedicated chapter to Araneta, very few scholars tend to revisit his works. At the same time, he also left voluminous manuscripts, published and unpublished, expressing his ideas. The researcher has been studying Bayanikasan for years, although I admit that this paper is more of intellectual history rather than philosophy, and I have studied the political aspect rather than the socio-economic, because this is part of my previous research when I was on my undergraduate, basically my undergraduate thesis. I have considered the question, can we consider Bayanikasan as Filipino philosophy? Conservatives in his time lambasted his idea as being communist, and the leftists tagged it as a tool of the clerico-fascism. It is also tagged as an impossible feat. It's just very idealistic, according to some critics and various colleagues during the Constitutional Convention. Many would dismiss his idea because he was a member of the oligarchic land-owning class. Academic trends have showed various answers to this question. Gripaldo favorably included Bayanikasan literatures into his critical bibliography as political and economic philosophy. A thorough reading of Bayanikasan and other related writings by Araneta made the researcher come to a conclusion that it falls under some categories stated in Demeterio's taxonomy of Filipino philosophy. Some schools of thought that advocates Filipinization in the social sciences might rule out because it is not written in Filipino, and there is more emphasis on foreign views rather than the innate Filipino. Regardless of how differing schools of thought view Bayanikasan, it is understood that an ideology must be taken in the context of his in the time that it was contextualized, or the time that it was formulated. For Araneta, Bayanikasan is his response to the tides of his time. It is what he formulated as a complex approach to the multitude of Philippine problems, and it has to be sustained as a national ideology, according to him. Furthermore, Araneta stated that Bayanikasan is already innate to the Filipino people, and it has to be developed by ourselves. So I hope that this presentation made you introduced to the idea for this lovely evening, and made discourses of it bloom like the 100 flowers. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Wogie Tabu Pacala, for your presentation.
Yeah.
So anyone who would like to ask questions, give their comments or insights, you may type in the chat box. Maybe they're still formulating their questions. So we have a question here from Mr. Jim Lester Beleno. What is your insight on the propagating community pantries all throughout the country? Can we say that it is an offshoot of Bayanikasan as a form of democratization? So, Sir Wagi, would you like to answer this one?
Uh, Probably this we can say yes, as again Araneta emphasized on the Bayanikasan as a organized togetherness of caring and sharing. So the community pan civic initiative rather than political, which is Araneta highly encouraged.
So, do you want a follow-up question for that, Mr. Beleno?
Okay, thank you, sir. So I will just give chance the others to raise questions.
Uh, Thank you, sir. So we have another question from, again, from Mr. Michael Roland Hernandez. What definition of Filipinization are you working upon?
I am basing this concept of Filipinization first on the Filipino philosophy, on the move on the what's this like the ones that were formulated by Mercado, Gripaldo, Ornedo, etc., etc. And on the other hand, the Filipinization or the concept of the Philippine studies or Araling Filipino as espoused in UP. So there were quite differing views on that.
So, Dr. Hernandez, you would like to have a follow-up question for that? All right. So, thank you for your question, Dr. Hernandez. So, any more questions? So, since there are no more questions, thank you, Sir yeah, Sir Wogie Pacala, for your presentation. Yeah. So I think that's it for our conference and speakers for today. Once again, thank you for the three paper presenters. We hope that you gained some insights and reflections regarding the Christianity and the Philippine intellectual landscape. So just some reminders. Now, don't forget to accomplish the evaluation form. So it was already posted in the chat box. So we hope you will continue supporting the following days of our conference. In behalf of my co-moderator MJ, thank you and have a great evening.